hole Mark Nabham was carefully digging in Willamette University lawn June 13th became a breakthrough June 26th in the search for the lost Mission Indian Manual Labor Training School. What GPR predicted was found, a likely post hole.
We actually found a circular structure made of stone that could have been a post, basically, for the corner of the building, which is kind of what we're looking at. When you dig down, there's a lot of orange and burnt material down here. Something happened here. You know, there was a fire and there was organic material there at one point in time.
We know that there was an Indian boarding school, but there were also outbuildings that were a part of this, and part of the buildings that we know existed, a carpenter shop, which also may have been a forge. We know a barn existed at one time. We know an outhouse was somewhere in this vicinity of these outbuildings. So today, I think the most significant thing we found is that the evidence has opened up the possibility that we have a structure that was man-made that may be part of one of the buildings. We don't know which one.
Mark and city archeologist Kimberli Fitzgerald scoped out what to do next before the next day when this phase of the search ends.
So we want to expose it and see what we can find and return whatever needs to be returned to whoever needs to be returned to. So.
Welcome to Insight. I'm Wendy Brokaw. Today, we spent another day at Willamette University where more clues in the search for the lost Mission Indian Manual Labor Training School were unearthed. And we've just returned from the site where Salem's archaeologist Kimberli Fitzgerald had told us, come have a look at some interesting finds. Well, welcome to in studio with us. You're dressed for battle.
Yes, fresh from the field. Thank you so much for having me.
It was an exciting day. What made it so wonderful?
Well, we had a pretty pivotal day today, and what that means for us is we've now been starting to find evidence of construction from the key period of time where the Indian Manual Labor Training School was built. So. And I know you've been out to the site before, and we've been out close to a month now, and as typically happens in archaeology, we usually find the best things right close to when we're ready to wrap up, and invariably that's what's happening.
When are you wrapping up?
Well, our last day is actually tomorrow.
Oh, for heaven's sakes, and then what happens?
Well, then we go back to the lab and do some curating, but a lot of what we've been doing this week and what I'm going to be doing in earnest tomorrow is making plans for what we're going to be doing next year. So we do a lot of, so what I'm responsible for doing is obtaining the archeology permit, which is something we get from the state of Oregon. And in that permit, we identify the areas that we want to dig. And so a lot of that for this year, we began, it's a mystery, you know, we know generally where the school was, but we don't know precisely where it was. And so we have a lot of research questions, and those questions regarding where was the school exactly, we frame how we're going to answer them in that permit. So we look at a lot of historic pictures. In this case, I think you've seen the one key one we have from 1868, which shows the building in the background, which I can't tell you how excited I was to find that picture, because we have several drawings. We did have another picture, but the building wasn't really visible. This one really helps us to confirm the context in relationship to Waller Hall and State Street.
Well, what made it hard was that it burned down. When?
Yes. So it burned down in 1872. And one of the key things we do in archaeology is we excavate in 10-centimeter levels. It's very scientific. We try to make it scientific, and we look for changes in the stratigraphy. So stratigraphy, that relates to soils, and the soils have different colors, and they make layers which are a lot like rings on a tree. So you know you can age a tree by looking at the rings. You can do the same thing with soil, and especially if you have what's called intact stratigraphy. So if you go below the surface and your soils have not been disturbed by planting a tree or digging it up to put in an irrigation pipe, they're intact, and people live on the surface and they drop things, or a building burns down and the debris, part of the debris is still there. So why today was so pivotal was because we've got 2, maybe 3 areas where we have an ash layer, we have construction material, and we have ceramics, which are diagnostic from that period of time when we know the school was active. So those 3 things all together are really key in telling us, okay, we're in the right place. Yeah.
And when you can establish that, does that help you piece together even more clues about the school?
Yes, yes. So one of the other really pivotal things, one of the key things we're learning, and actually honestly was a surprise to me, was we want to better understand how the land around the school was used. And so I think that you were looking earlier today at the area that Mark was excavating, one of our volunteers, a Portland State archeology student. And both he and Roy, an Oregon Archaeological Society volunteer, have been excavating in the area of the site where the outbuildings were. And I knew from research and historic maps that there were outbuildings, and I anticipated a barn. The map showed a barn and maybe a garage. What I didn't expect was to find an area where they did blacksmithing, metalwork, or a forge, and that's what we've been finding. And more than that, in Mark's unit, we've got the intact stratigraphy, and we've got a very clear feature showing a post hole, what we think is a post hole, but we're not sure. So that's part of what we're going to be doing tomorrow, is doing our last day of excavation, but also writing down our research questions. So when we come back next year, we're going to prioritize, okay, we're going to pick up where we left off, right? And we're going to see, okay, where else do we want to excavate? Do we want to keep this feature intact? Do we want to excavate around it? So this is what we're going to be doing tomorrow, but also in the upcoming year.
Put this in context for us. This was the Oregon Mission Manual Labor Training School.
Correct.
Tell us, what was that all about? Because apparently children from all over the Pacific Northwest, Native American children, were sent to it for training.
Right. So this school was constructed by the Methodists, and it was opened in 1842. However, schools like this had already been constructed by Methodists across the country. Prior to that, this was the first one that was constructed in the Oregon country. It wasn't even a territory yet. And these schools were funded by the federal government. So the federal government provided money to religious organizations to construct these schools, again, all over the country. And it's fascinating because the Methodists have done their own research, and they issued a report in fall of last year documenting the location of all these schools across the country. There were close to 250 of them in the early 1800s. And they were intended to help to train indigenous children in Euro-American farming methods, in religious studies, and it was part of the federal government's goal to assimilate them into the American culture. So they had many things they did in order to achieve this that were then picked up and done in later federal boarding schools like Chemawa. But these were the first ones, and they were not run by the federal government, but they were run by religious organizations, and yet paid for by the federal government. So in the Oregon country, the Methodist missionaries, they for lack of a better word, acquired children in several different ways. So sometimes they would convince the parents to to send their children to the school because it would be a benefit, like they would get a good education. Oftentimes orphans, because many of the indigenous children had been orphaned because of the severe sickness that had been just wiping out many, sometimes whole villages in the Willamette Valley. In that time period, there were many orphans who were sent to the Methodists so that they would be taken care of.
Why were they dying? Was this because of first contact with the new settlers?
Yes. So it was actually, it was actually the Hudson's Bay Company. Initially, they were here before the Methodists, and everyone's heard of Lewis and Clark and 1803, 1804, but during that early period before 1834, it was the Hudson Bay Company fur traders who and other traders who came to Astoria and that route, but they brought with them those typical European type of diseases. I was surprised to learn that it was actually malaria that was the one that was most prolific in that area just before the 1830s, that killed a lot of indigenous people. But there was also other diseases that had been prolific on the East Coast, and they came by ship. And unfortunately, the indigenous population just didn't have any ability to fight that off, and they didn't have really any medicine either to fight it off the way that Europeans did.
At these schools, what were they taught to do in the way of manual labor?
Right, yeah, so...
Like for the girls?
For the girls, so backing up a little bit, when these children were brought into the mission, they were renamed. So they were not allowed to keep their indigenous name, they could not speak their indigenous language, they could not wear their indigenous clothes. So we have documentation, we have lists of the children's name, which tribe they came from, and then their new name, their Americanized, anglicized name. And the girls were taught cooking, sewing. What's interesting, we have found shoes on the site. They were taught to make shoes. The boys were taught more, well, ironwork, metalwork, farming, the agriculture, like harvesting, planting and harvesting. They had animals. It was a working farm, so they had cows, they had pigs. We found a pig skull. So yes, so it was hard work. They were also taught, they had as part of their day, the Bible.
The school only lasted 2 years?
Right, correct.
What happened?
So there started to become, the people in the East, so that was the Methodist Board, began receiving reports from the Oregon country about the poor conditions of the school, and also just in general the operations of the mission. And so they sent out Reverend George Gary. So George Gary was someone that had been living in New York. He's a Methodist, but he was instructed by the board to do an inspection and assessment of not just the school, but all the mission stations in the Oregon country, just to do an accounting of how things were going. And his diary, Reverend George Gary's diary, has been published in the Oregon Historical Quarterly, so you can read his account of it. He was so distressed about the condition of the school itself and the children, he recommended that it be closed immediately.
What did he find?
And I don't know if you want to give a warning to your listeners, but it was very disturbing. What he found was, for example, the students who had tried to run away, and some did, ones that were caught were brought back, and they were chained to a wall and whipped, beaten, food was withheld, so it was very much like a prison for some of these children.
That's very hard to hear.
Yes, it was hard. It's hard to read, yes.
When you work on preserving the sites, and artifacts that might be very important to Native Americans, the Grand Ronde tribes, for example, that is working with you, and the Silex. And how do you work with them to protect what you find that is of value to them as well? All of you collaborating this way.
Right, yeah, and that's something that we talked about early on, and that permit the archaeology permit that I spoke about, which I obtained before we even got onto the site. And we discussed it at our archaeological roundtable. So I have a tribal roundtable, which is part of my larger archaeological program. And that tribal roundtable includes representatives from the Silex, the Grand Ronde, and also Warm Springs. And so one of the things that they helped do, and they continue to help with even today, and they're going to be helping in the next few days, and then when we're back at the lab, is to determine what to do when we find not just artifacts but features and what to do with them. And so we have something within that permit that defines, okay, this is how we treat indigenous artifacts. This is how we treat if we find human remains. This is what you do. This is what we do when we find historic artifacts or evidence of the building. And so that's all laid out in the permit. We agree ahead of time what the process is for what to do when these things are found. And there's a lot of communication. So if I find something, I'll usually call. I have key contacts at each tribe, and they've come to the site multiple times. And so we talk through, okay, this is what we're going to do. Some things we leave in place, some things we take out and then we analyze further. But this year it's very cool because especially we're working very closely with the Grand Ronde tribe. We're adding an element of the digital documentation, which is something new to me, and I'm very excited about it. So we're using iPads this year, and two gentlemen from the Confederate Tribes of the Grand Ronde, I think you interviewed Jeremy last time, and he demonstrated how to use the LiDAR.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, in fact, I was just talking.
Fascinating.
Yes, and so we're going to be using the data collected across the site because we're seeing I think you saw some of that cobble floor. We're getting that cobble all over the site. So we're going to try to use that data from the LiDAR to analyze the levels and be able to map them not just across one site, but across the whole area that we've been excavating, which will, I think, help us better understand what we're seeing.
I understand that the city of Salem has well over about 250 archaeological sites, and you're in charge of archaeological compliance
Yes.
with all of these sites, and your style is award-winning because it's so unique. You talked about a roundtable. What do you do that's so unique and different that's actually working?
Yeah,
to make sure that the integrity of these sites is kept.
Yes, yes, yeah, and our program has been recognized by the state and also by the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions and the Society for American Archaeology because of the public archaeology piece, so the work we're doing like with this project at Willamette University, but also with the day-to-day. So with this tribal roundtable, and this is unique, it's the only jurisdiction in Oregon that I'm aware of that does it, and it's modeled after our Historic Landmarks Commission, our Planning Commission. So those are two commissions. If you're familiar with how they work, they're made up of representatives from the community, and they talk about specific projects and specifically in relationship to criteria. So for example, the Landmarks Commission reviews projects with the goal in mind of preserving the integrity of historic buildings, like the Capitol building. Anything that you would think of, oh, that's old, that's cool, we should make sure it stays cool looking. Yeah, that's what they do. So the Tribal Roundtable is similar, but the goal is in ensuring the protection of these archaeological resources. As you mentioned, we have 250 sites, and Salem is a growing city. we're building things all the time, and the way that it's been set up is very similar to these other commissions where we have criteria for how to handle, okay, let's say we're going to build a building and we happen to know there's an archaeological site either near where the people want to build the building, or it's going to be on top of it. What do we do? How do we handle it?
Did you have something like that come up recently?
Oh yes. So for example, I'll share with you the site where the Jason Lee House is. So that's on Broadway. And that one came up, it was our first public-private partnership, and we used the Tribal Roundtable, and we collaborated with Willamette University and the tribes on that one because we knew the Jason Lee House was there, and yet they're wanting to build a 2-3 story building there, and wanted to ensure that they were able to meet the archaeological criteria, the requirements, and we wanted to make sure that the site wasn't adversely affected. So that's where our process, our roundtable came in. And so we went out again in 2020. What was happening then? I don't know. We did our testing where we found the location of the foundation. So we did work similar to what we're doing now at Willamette University, but much faster, because one of the key things to remember of when we've got development happening is we want to be able to protect these resources and better understand what's there, but you have to do it a lot faster. So we did digging, we did testing, we did documentation, we did some artifact recovery, we did a lot of communication with the tribes and with the developer, but we were still able to make sure that they were able to keep on their schedule to construct their building, and they were able to do that. Yeah.
Getting back to our conversation involving the extraordinary history that is part of the Indian Manual Training School. Mm-hmm. Have you wanted to know, where do we get some documentation from other people who experienced anything or had great-great-grandparents who did? How are there stories out there that have been passed down through the generations about the impact on the tribes?
Yes, one of our most important and key sources of what I like to call primary source documentation are actually journals or personal photographs, if there are any. So a lot of our information, again, I mentioned earlier Reverend George Gary, he kept a personal journal, and that's how we learned a lot about what he saw when he came out here to analyze what was happening at the school. And so one of our goals on we had our public outreach, our archaeology day, and we had a sign up, if you have pictures, if you have a family member that went to Willamette, even if you don't think it's important, we are trying to create a timeline of pictures. So we want to not only understand what the landscape was like in 1842, we want to understand what's happened between 1842 and now. And our best way to do that is through photographs. That's ideal, but we also look at maps because we're looking at, again, going back to that analogy of rings on a tree, when we're looking at the stratigraphy, when we're looking at the use of the land, it's impacted by everything that's happened on that land since 1842. And it's like pieces of a puzzle, and we're putting those together. So when we're digging, we are going back in time, but say like we are sort of at the top in the, say, 1950s level, and we find something and we're like, huh, I wonder why we're finding that. Well, if we had a whole lot of pictures from a whole lot of people, we would be able to put that puzzle together a lot more easily. So anybody who has anything, please send them my way.
And that's a perfect way to let people know, how do they get in touch with you?
Well, the best way is actually just to go to the city's website, cityofsalem.net, and there's a search bar up there. You can just type my name in and my contact information will pop up.
Kimberli Fitzgerald.
Yes.
Well, this has been an extraordinary day today, and it fits so beautifully with our Insight On-Site, which amazed us. And here we are, back again at the same site, still yielding up more treasures, and just before it's time to close for the season.
I know, but I hope we can come back next year, because I am very optimistic that we're going to find what we're looking for.
Are you kidding? I think the community is going to go along with us to the diggings.
Yay! I hope so.
Oh, thank you so much for being my guest today on Insight, Kimberli. It's been a wonderful day and a memorable season and experience.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you for joining us today on Insight. I'm Wendy Brokaw.